So,
well, Irene is going to handle the technology side of things. Can you see the slide pack? Is it up in front of you?
yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. I'll work my way through it. So what I plan to do is because you've got the briefing paper, it explains in a fair bit of detail what actually happens within a participating design workshop, which normally run for 2 days. I wanted to spend some time on what you need to do before a PDW and what you need to do afterwards. So, yeah. And because it's only a relatively small group, you can ask questions anytime. I did I said to Irina, I'll allow time for questions after I do the participative design workshop process or the methodology, and so we can have questions then, and then we can have further questions after I go through the examples. But if you've got a burning question that you want to ask straight away, yeah, then go for it. So yeah, thanks for joining us today, and I hope everybody's well, if there anybody from the Californian part of the world, they're coping with the heat and the fires there. We know what you're going through. So yes, the title is Designing Cooperative Organisations for a Sustainable Future, and the focus is on the participative design workshop, which is basically a participative socio-technical systems methodology, which I'll explain later. So when if we look at the next one, when I embark on any PDW, it's always got to be in the context of what's happening with that organisation. So what we try to explain we talk to the senior management, obviously, about what's happening in their industry. We look at what are the big issues that are causing uncertainty in their business environment. And on the right-hand side there, I just listed some of the things that have been cropping up of late. We've just been discussing things about geopolitical tensions. And one of the biggest issues that all organisations need to face is what we call discontinuous change. So that's where people are changing their minds about what they believe in. So that leads to issues around what products and services they'll buy and use. So you've got to be on top of that. So we look at to see whether an organisation has actually established strategic goals, what we call active adaptive strategic goals. So are they constantly scanning and learning from the environment? What are the threats and opportunities out there? And are they, when they execute their plans, is it for a more desirable future? And that desirable future could be around, improving the customer experience. Have they got plans to reduce their carbon footprint and so forth? So they're what known as active adaptive strategic plans. And often in our training program, we will teach the transition group that we train up within an organisation on how to do active adaptive strategic planning, which is primarily the search conference methodology, which you may have heard of. And that enables the transition team to be able to do focus groups, so to engage the workforce in having some understanding that what the business is facing, the challenges it's facing, but also having input into their strategic plan. So it's another way of creating cooperative workplaces or organisations when you start to engage people, the workforce in the planning process. So that's what a lot of the work I do at the start is all around contextualisation, what the organisation is facing, knowing it's an open system. And for an organisation to be able to develop active adaptive strategic plans, they need to have highly adaptive organisation itself. So they need to be able to continuously adapt, because your strategic plans may, you may have to drop one strategic goal because, and create a new one because things are happening in the environment where you've got to move in a different direction. So the business needs to be able to respond very quickly to that. But just listening to CEOs over the last few months and how COVID-19 has really impacted their business, so, you know, they just describe it, we've got to become much more lean and agile. We've got to be able to adopt leading, you know, technology and so forth, leading edge technology. Alan Joyce said the other day, he's the CEO of Qantas, that our business has become a smaller, leaner business. We've got to adapt to that. So it's an important part of the participative design workshop is to understand the context with which the business operates, all the issues that it's dealing with, because a PDW is not just a standalone methodology, it's within the context of what's happening with the business.
Peter, can you take a question or not? I don't want to.
Yeah, go for it, Bert.
Yeah, so as you say, this is a contextualizing step. My question is, this references the search as well, because that's part of the strategic sort of precedent to the PDW. Does this process also identify for you and for the organization who may be participants who come from outside the organization in either or both the search conference or the PDW? In other words, it's not just understanding sort of what forces that are at play, but also what participants have a stake in the future of the organization.
Yeah, excellent question there, Bert. Yes, we do we do a social mapping. So it's basically identifying all the key ecosystem players. And so you're looking at who does the organisation interact with regularly? So suppliers, regulators, customers, obviously, and they become an important part of the PDW in terms of getting feedback or informing ecosystem players and getting feedback from them. One of the big mistakes we made with one organisation, it's a shoe manufacturer, is that they were making about 4,000 or 5,000 pairs of shoes a day, and they were trying to compete with China, by the way. So we engaged the whole workforce into running little focus groups, having input into the future direction of the organisation. Their strategic plan that they came up with was to focus on high fashion women's shoes, so because they were constantly changing, rather than your run-of-the-mill shoes that could be produced in China. But what we didn't do, it was a very successful participative design workshop. or a whole series of them. And it led to the business growing its market share from 12% to over 60%. So it was highly successful. It was written up in business magazines and things like that. But what we didn't do was actively engage the ecosystem players, the members of the ecosystem. And some of those were the leather tanning companies who they weren't adapting quickly enough to what the business was doing. So the business required, you know, red leather, raw material, this much on that time. Now we want blue, now we want green. And the leather tanning companies weren't able to adapt quickly enough. And it caused that business to actually shut down because they couldn't get regular supply. So, yes, Bert, it is important to, when you do this contextualization, is to understand who are the key players in your ecosystem, how much involvement should they have, and so forth. And it includes unions and so forth. I talk about that in some of the examples that we'll go through later. But yeah, good question. Good question. So I go to the next slide. So this is what I'm aiming to do, is introduce you to the organisational design principles, if you haven't seen them before, and obviously the participative design workshop, which I say is a participative SDS methodology. I'll show you where the SDS component of that is in a minute. How the design principles affect motivation, cooperation, and actually mental health and productivity. Some performance improvement examples, and all the planning and preparation you've got to do before you embark on these sorts of exercises. Because you're fundamentally changing the DNA of the organisation. Because design principle 1, which I'll show you in a minute, is the opposite to design principle 2. So actually fundamentally changing the genotypical design principles, they're called. In fact, Fred identified these back in, Fred Emery that is, back in the 70s. But there was another woman from California, and I've forgotten her name. She was from I think the University of San Francisco. She independently identified these design principles around the mid-1990s. Marilyn Emery gave me reference to her work. So Fred's come up with them, but they've been independently identified by at least one other person we know of. So before we'll go through the number of steps within the PDW, but the main step that we do right up front is to look at these intrinsic motivators, because really what you're trying to do in terms of measuring those is determine the level of interest people have in getting the job done, whether it's people of, cooperating and working together to help the business meet its goals, or whether their interest lies elsewhere, self-interest and survival in many instances. So this is a key part of the social systems analysis, is to go through these intrinsic motivators, and I've explained them in detail in the briefing paper. And most people get them as soon as you put that diagram up on, and show workers. That shoe manufacturing one I was talking before, most of the workforce were Vietnamese, so English wasn't their first language. So, but as soon as you start to show them diagrams like this, they get it pretty quickly. And so what we do in the workshop is to, so if you've got what we call a deep slice, of the organisation involved with the workforce, we would get them to, say that involves management, middle management, and then the frontline workers. They sit down and go through and actually measure them. And management get to see how motivated people are. And often in the design principle 1 structure, people, you know, have dead-end jobs, like they don't have a desirable future. Their meaningfulness is low. They don't see the whole product. Mutual support and respect is low because they're looking out for their own interests, not the interests of others. And they're the top 3, which are the optimal scores: elbow room, learning on the job, and variety. They're low in most organisations too. So, and it's the way that the organisation's designed that causes those low scores. And so if we have a look at this, this is design principle 1, which we're all familiar with, have all worked in these sorts of organisations. The 2 key features of this are the redundancy of parts. Some people get a bit concerned when we use the term redundancy. I think it's to do with getting rid of people, but it's just an engineering term. It's when this design principle 1 here is a system, so it needs to have redundancy built into it to cope with different demands placed on it. It's a bit like when you fly an aeroplane, you want to have redundant systems in it. So if one computer system fails, there's a backup system there. So redundancy of parts means that the work itself, a whole task, is being broken down into parts. So you have, in this instance, the parts X, Y, Z, and W. And so that whole task is broken down into those parts there. And then you have people employed to do the job related to that particular task. So A does X, B does the Y job, C, Z, D, W. And S1, the first line supervisor, is put in charge of those people and is responsible for the goals. So when you look at the 6 criteria that we talked about before, the intrinsic motivators, if S1's doing their job properly, then A, B, C, and D don't have much room to move in terms of the decision making they have, or the challenge that they and learning they can have in their job, and also the variety. So you get pretty poor scores in those 6 criteria, especially at the bottom of the organisation. But the further you go up to the top, the scores start to improve because management at the top have more control over their work. So what happens is, we've done thousands of these, especially you see first line supervisors, they've got too many balls to juggle. So they have, in terms of elbow room and decision making, they get, in terms of the optimal scores, they get a high score like +3, +4. But if you take the people A, B, C, and D, they have too little elbow room and decision making and variety. So they get negative scores. So you've got this, you know, mismatch of scores that if you design the work properly, you could improve the scores of S1 and the people at the front line. And when you get low scores like that, you know, people, they're not interested in improving the goals. They're interested in making sure that they do their job properly in the eyes of S1, because they want to get the only way to get promoted and to get an increase in wages or salary is to go to the next hierarchy with that what we call the dominant hierarchy of authority, the design principle one structure. So you get mutual support and respect, which is a good measure of teamwork, is low in these structures, because it actually induces competition. You get A, B, C, and D actually competing with each other to go to the next level. So I remember Fred telling me, Fred Emery, years ago, before he died, actually, he said, look, if you don't get those 6 criteria right, there won't be the human interest in seeing the job through. So it's a key outcome of the PDW is to improve those 6 criteria. The other key feature of the design principle 1 structure is the responsibility of control and coordination. It rests at least one level above where the work is being done. So S1 is responsible for controlling A, B, C, and D and coordinating their work. Control and coordination are the 2 dimensions of work, so it rests with S1. So A, you're going to be doing X today, and you've got to meet these, as your job description says, you've got to meet these outcomes, quality outcomes, etc. And you're going to be working with C, and B, you're going to be working with D. So they coordinate. S1's coordinating. And what happens when you get that situation? You get what's known as group dynamics. You get dependency. I don't know if you've ever been in a supervisory role, but I've experienced it quite a lot. You get people becoming dependent on the supervisor, or you get the other dynamics of what's known as fight-flight. So they're actively fighting the supervisor and resisting their instructions, or passively doing it, which is really difficult to pick up. And this type of structure even occurs in all sorts of situations. Even when we're running the workshops, when you're presenting, you've got the dynamics of fight, flight, or dependency. So you've got to be aware of that. When you become the lecturer or the supervisor or whatever it is, you've got to be aware of those dynamics. And when you run a search conference, you've actually got to be aware of them and seeing whether people are working against you. So it's important to understand those dynamics that are occurring in the situation, whether it's a participated design workshop or a search conference. Often you'll get in a PDW, you'll get those, and they're often unionized. In a unionized site, you'll get the union delegates that actively work against you. And, this is crap, what are we doing this for? So you know that they're the people you need to get on site and work with them, because they can become your advocates for change. So yeah, it's not just about running this step by step. When we train people up in this, we show them all these things that are behind the scenes, like the group dynamics, things like the strategy of indirect approach that we use in the search conference. So how do you get people on side and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's not just a mechanical step-by-step process you go through. So, but that's design principle one, most of us have worked in it. I had a hell of a time when I worked in the, I used to work for Exxon and supervising storemen and what they call storemen and packers, people who worked in warehouses and things like that. And you'd say to one group, look, I want you to clean up this section. We've got a bit of a problem. And then you go down to the other section and find out what the problem is down there. And when you come back to where the group that you're first working with, who you asked to clean things up, they're still standing around with their brooms, not waiting for the next instruction. So it causes all sorts of issues for the poor old S1s and S2s. So yeah, it's a structure that came out of the Industrial Revolution 200 odd years ago, and the environment then was stable compared to what we have today, especially values and expectations were much more stable than what they are today. So people 200 years ago respected authority. You know, they would take instructions and things like that and not question like they do today. So it's really a structure that's past its use by date, even though a lot of organisations are designed this way. It doesn't really cope with the high levels of uncertainty and unpredictability we have in the environment. It exists in organisations that are protected, legislatively protected by, you know, like the public servants or the civil servants who don't have to deal with the uncertainty, or the high level of uncertainty that a lot of private businesses have to deal with. So often you'll get public servants designed this way, or civil servants. So that's design
Peter,
principle. Yeah.
I guess I've got another question. Hopefully that won't be disruptive, but
No.
yeah, I mean, I think, like many of our colleagues, I of course have great respect and familiarity with the intrinsic factors you've identified here, and
Yeah.
the effect of the DP1 on the development of a low level of intrinsic development.
Yeah.
So it, you know, I think from my experience working with PDW, and the way you've sort of framed the presentation today about how important it is to talk about these organizational design principles early on, this must be a very, very important discussion with a client organization, because as you say, it's a tectonic shift going from DP1 to DP2. So they have to understand, as you say, the impact on intrinsic satisfaction. I wonder also, you mentioned something about adaptiveness. And I just wonder whether or not that increasingly becomes a critical issue associated with DP1. I mean, this clearly identifies the connection with the intrinsic factors, but the motivational factors. But the whole issue of organizational adaptive capability, I think, has become increasingly significant.
Yeah.
So how does that show up in the way you talk about this? Because it seems to me that at this stage in the process, you're having to come to some development with the client organization about actually making a shift in their organizing principles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Big change for people to embrace.
It is huge. But most of the organizations I work with are forced to change. They've got that burning platform where they can't continue with the status quo.
Okay.
I find that the environment we're in at the moment, there's a lot more interest in design principles and the PDW because organisations, as you were saying, have to adapt virtually on the spot. Some change is happening in real time in the environment.
Right.
So, hospitality organisations have gone from serving, say, in a restaurant to takeaway meals, and then working with companies like Uber. So they've had to adapt really quickly. The issues a lot of Western countries are dealing with, a lot of companies dealing with China who are pushing back on and asserting their authorities. Some companies now are bringing their manufacturing onshore, back home again. So they've got to adapt very quickly in those situations. So it's very, very fluid. And what happens in design principle one structure is when you get those lows, it creates low scores in those intrinsic motivators. So when you get that happening, people are just looking out for themselves.
Well,
they're not really looking out for the business goals.
So let me use an example with this diagram you've got up.
Yeah.
You've got two S1s reporting to an S2, a higher level supervisor, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So in real life, possibly there's a departmental boundary between S1 in the center here and S1 on the other side.
Yeah,
okay? It could be, for example, S1 for the emergency department in a hospital and S1 in the ICU.
Yeah.
The critical care unit, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And in terms of adaptive capability, this model relies on essentially communication between S1, S2, and S1 to handle any issues in the balancing of work between the emergency department and ICU.
Yeah.
But the real identification of the issues that they're arising in the balancing of work are occurring and are being identified at the level of ABCD. And there's an EFGHI over in the ICU.
Yep.
You see what I mean?
Yep.
And so if you're going to get adaptivity, you've got a very delayed response time with this model.
Yes.
That's what I'm trying to say. Whether that, in a sense, is something that this conceptualization can help people understand. It's not just the impact on motivation. It's the impact on adaptive capability.
Yep. And what you were describing there were two silos.
Yes, exactly. But this structures people in silos.
Yeah. Yep.
It structures departments in silos.
Yep. And as soon as you create silos, you get things falling through the cracks between going from one silo to the other. And that's why it's a redundancy of parts. You're breaking the whole task that a group could do into parts. And those either at the job level or at the department level. So that's when we do the PDWs. We actually map out we do the technical systems analysis, which I'll show, and you look at the whole process. So a patient coming into emergency department, having to go into ICU, what's the best way of organising the work so that it's a seamless flow for the patient? And so
So I hear you saying in a way that the issue of adaptability tends to show up more through the technical analysis.
Yeah.
So my question may be a bit premature because you're going to talk about that, I guess.
Yeah.
If I could put something on the table here too, I think one of the things, Peter, you're saying is that this is a very important issue today in our organizations. And I think if we take the example that Bert raised of the connection between the ICU and the emergency department, we have a relative that works in an ICU setting, and what she has said is that we had problems being able to get our personal protective equipment when the worst of the COVID was hitting us. And oh, by the way, we didn't have set procedures and processes and protocols in place for knowing how to move patients or when to move patients from the emergency department to the ICU. And of course, they didn't have enough facilities, beds, equipment, et cetera, and even personnel assigned in the ICU or the ED as far as that goes for being able to handle this. And again, the siloed nature of the organization confounded that and made it so that the organization was much less adaptive. And then to go back to your basic principles of motivation, we had a lot of pissed off nurses that were really upset because the protocols weren't designed, they weren't in place, the communication wasn't in place, they didn't have the equipment they needed. And so they had no elbow room in terms of having input to the decision making that was required by the health status of the people that were coming into the ICU and the ED. So I think that's a perfect illustration of how this can be a real problem.
And I think COVID's really exposed the siloed nature of the healthcare sector, and how, you know, general practitioners are protecting their patch and specialists are protecting their patch. It's really exposed the vulnerabilities of that whole system, and because with advanced digital technology and artificial intelligence, the healthcare sector's been really slow to take that up. I mean, there are still some parts of the Australian sector that are using faxes, for goodness sake. But I think COVID has accelerated the need to get rid of those silos, the need to do telehealth and things like that. It's in the last 3 or 4 months, I've just seen this dramatic increase in the healthcare sector getting up to speed with, you know, digital technology, and that's been forced upon them. But it was what I was saying before. There's a real interest in the PDW now and the design principles, because the nature of the environment has forced people to think about it. When things are going well and everybody's cruising along, I don't get much, there's not many inquiries around doing a redesign and changing design principles. But when when the people are under the pump, that's when you start to get the interest. But anyway, we'll go through some of those examples or discuss some of those things when I talk about the 3 examples later. So the only way to that I know of to improve those intrinsic motivators is to change the design principle. And when you put this up in front of a workforce that's got managers and middle managers in it, people say, well, hang on, where's S1 gone? And yeah, so it's we get to that, but this is the basic building block of a design principle 2 organisation, which is a self-managing group, basically. So you still got the same people, A, B, C, and D, still doing the same tasks, X, Y, Z, and W, but now it's a whole task. It hasn't been split into those individual jobs. They're now working on the whole task, and that whole task could be a complete product or a service or a major component of a product. So it's A, B, C are now responsible for the goals of that section. So they're now working together and looking at who's going to be doing what task to help them achieve the goals of the section. If this is a frontline group, they would have negotiated goals with the next level of management. So there would be agreed goals there that they're working on, and the goals that they are working on cover all the dimensions of the work. So it's not just output goals. If you just have focus on output goals, if it was production line, then what we've found is that the teams, to achieve their goals, they break safety rules, things like that. So you've got to cover all the dimensions of their work, which is quality, training, safety. So, and it becomes what's called a redundancy of functions model. So DP1 was redundancy of parts, so it gets its flexibility by having more people and parts in the system that it needs at any particular point in time. And I gave an example in the briefing paper about when a machine on a production line breaks down, there are 4 parts involved in getting that. That's the worker, their supervisor, the maintenance supervisor, and the fitter or the electrician that would fix up that particular machine. So there are 4 parts there. In this, if this was a production line, you'd build into the skill and knowledge within the group the breakdown maintenance skills, so that they could fix that production or keep that production line running so they can meet their goals. So it becomes a redundancy of functions model. So there are more skills built into A, B, C, and D than what you'd have in Design Principle 1. And the other key feature is that they're responsible for controlling and coordinating their work. So they would work out amongst themselves who's going to be doing task X today, who's going to be doing task W, based on the knowledge and skill that they have within the group. So it has a dramatic improvement in those 6 criteria.
So Peter, while you're on this diagram,
yeah.
Again, hopefully this is a quick enough question to answer. The control and coordination, the most obvious form of that is internal to this whole group. The internal coordination, the balancing of tasks and functions amongst A, B, C, D.
Yeah.
How do you speak to the control and coordination issue relative to this team, say it's in the emergency department, and the team that's in ICU? Because there's also a coordination issue there. How do you speak to that given this formulation?
Well, you'd have to look at the process flow between those 2 departments, and then look at how do we design work that's going to better meet the needs of the customers, better meet the needs of the workforce. You would be looking at it. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. It could be that you have an emergency department and an ICU group working together, but there could be 3 of those groups working in parallel. I don't understand enough about the actual workplace itself. So if you were able to map out what actually happens, where the errors occur in that system, so things falling through the cracks, whatever, how do we design the work so people are working on a whole task that better improves the healthcare of the people coming through that system? That's
in my experience, Peter, once there's an understanding about this, the value of internal control and coordination, and how that facilitates motivation and adaptive capability, people also, as you say, once they understand the dependencies in the process, become more open to the idea that there's also an element of external control and coordination that some degree gets assumed by ABCD, as well as their own internal coordination.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
So,
because if you think about the model or situation of emergency department and ICU, how the ICU, the extent to which they are ready to receive patients on very quick notice may make a huge difference to the emergency department.
right.
So they want to make sure that they can coordinate pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So I mean, the technical analysis will show some of this, but it seems to me that DP2 carries also out into the issue of external control and coordination to some degree. And I'm just putting that out there as an hypothesis from my own experience.
Yep. There might be, I don't know, their goals might be have service level agreements between the two different groups. So
Right.
your emergency department and your ICU. If you've got a patient that's come in by ambulance and is in the emergency department, and they do the assessment that this person is in dire straits, they need to go to the ICU for ventilation or whatever it may be. That's where you're saying that external coordination between the two groups needs to take place.
I would say in a more DP2 fashion than is conventional
Yeah.
in a DP1 organization.
Yeah.
That's all.
So you might have someone from the ICU who is working with the emergency department as a communications person to warn their ICU colleagues.
Correct.
We're going to get 3 people coming in, and these are the conditions they're facing. This is going to happen in the next hour, so get ready for it.
Right, and of course, in today's digital world, there's a whole bunch of communication technology that facilitates that quick response time.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway,
I'll show you some examples that are coming up, and they might help you with some of those questions you've got. So that's design principle 2. It's a basic building block of the design principle 2 structure, which is called, you still have a hierarchy. It's a hierarchy of function. So you have a strategic group that's looking out long term and looking at the health and direction of the organisation. Then typically you'll have so this would be in a business unit. You would have a resource group that is a resource to the senior management. So the resource group is, explaining policies and procedures and goals to the frontline group. So, which is the frontline group has a shorter time horizon, might be 1 month out to 6 months, their planning horizon. So that's what differentiates the hierarchies of function in the DP2 structure, which is those planning horizons. Yes, so when you have that type of structure, there are errors coming into the system. So in DP1, when an error comes into a system, so if a customer has a complaint and an operational group hasn't done its job properly, and the error comes into the system, they know about it. Well, usually they don't tell anybody because it will harm their chances of being promoted. So it's usually not communicated up the hierarchy in DP1. But in DP2, it's seen as an opportunity to actually learn and okay, how do we make sure that error doesn't happen again? So change can be initiated from the front line, the resource management, or senior management in the hierarchy of function DP2 model. So, you know, I explained that, a lot of that in the briefing paper. So if we have a look at the next slide, which is the actual participative design workshop itself. So normally it runs over 2 days, but it depends on the complexity of the organisation. One of the examples I show, it ran over 3 days. And it's, the first part is the analysis. So it's important that senior management spell out the strategic goals and the challenges the business is facing. So normally a senior exec would come in. So if it was, we're looking at the operations, you'd have the operations vice president or the director come in and talk about the issues that that part of the business is facing, and more generally what the overall business challenges are. And they would then, that's help sets the context for the participative design workshop. And that's why it's important that you have that, do that upfront work around contextual setting and making sure you've got those active adaptive goals in place, because if you're dealing at the operational level, they need to understand, yes, the business is facing these challenges. Here are our goals at the moment, but they could change depending what happens in the environment. And we need to, as a frontline operational group, we need to be able to design work so we can adapt quickly to help the business meet its goals. So that's very important that all that contextual stuff's done beforehand. So the senior management comes in, and before these PDWs, there's a whole lot of work that's done beforehand, and we go through that in the slide right at the bottom, the planning and preparation. But assuming that we've done all that planning and preparation, the senior management comes in, talks about those challenges and goals, and then leaves, and then comes back at the final part of the in briefing 3 to actually look at what the PDW has actually produced, the goals that they're focusing on, say at the operational level, and you know, give feedback to the senior manager, and vice versa. He gives feedback to the group that's been doing the PDW. So that's a key component, first step in the participative design workshop. Then we get into measuring the intrinsic motivators and the skills matrix. So that's your social systems analysis, and then we do the high level process mapping. And it's not like your typical STS, you know, expert driven approach. This is highly participative and involves the whole workforce. So that's part of your planning. How do we get everybody to have input into this design? And depending on the size of the organisation, you have to look at having multiple workshops. So you have your key participative design workshop, which would include the diagonal slice of the business unit you're looking at. So senior management, a sprinkling of middle management, and then the operational workforce. So it works out in them. So if there's 100 people in that section, you would have 20 people in the workshop. You take about 1/5 of it, and the ratios of frontline people to the 100 would be, you know, sort of a representative match of what it looks like in the larger business unit. So you do that analysis, but then, and you go through with those 20 people doing the workshop, but then you've got to have a take back workshop to engage the other 80 that weren't involved. And then you then get their input into it. And then there's agreement on the overall structure, and people know where they are working in this new type of structure. So with briefing one does the analysis, the social analysis, the intrinsic motivators, skills matrix, and we do that high level process mapping to look at how do we design work and get whole tasks back into the work. So that's your socio-technical systems analysis there in briefing one. Briefing two, we look at DP2. So we explain what we just went through, DP1 and its impact on the intrinsic motivators in briefing one. Then DP2, we look briefing two, we look at DP2 and its impact on the intrinsic motivators. We get them to draw the existing structure, their DP1 structure, and you find a lot of people, especially at the operational level, have no idea what the structure is like. And sometimes middle management don't understand or have no idea what the structure is like too, especially if it's a big, complex organisation. So that can take quite some time to actually get the existing DP1 structure identified. Sometimes you need to put initials down to make sure that we've covered everybody in the organisation. So the example I give down below on the disability care, people had no idea who worked where because so many of the people worked remotely. They were remote workers. So it took us quite some time to actually get that structure cleaned up and clear about who worked where. Then we break them into groups and they draw or redesign their new way of working, the DP2 structure based on those whole tasks and based on giving good jobs to everybody involved. And then once we get agreement on the DP2 structure, we then go into briefing three. So the goals are very important. They work out the goals that they'll be focusing on and committed to. Their training requirements come from the skills matrix that they do initially in briefing one. So that skills, they're looking at the essential skills they need to have in place to be able to deliver the product or service in their section of work. So in their training requirements in briefing three, they look at who's got what skills. The rule of thumb there is that we need to have at least 2 people in the group with essential skills. So if one person's away, there's someone to back up. Then they start looking at their career paths, because in a DP2 structure, you're remunerating people for the knowledge and skill that they have, not for the job that they're doing. So you need to have in place a career path structure. You set up a terms and conditions group. If it's a unionised organisation, you'd have usually HR, the unions, and in Australia, we've got the Fair Work Commission, which is our Industrial Relations Commission. They help with actually setting up the new terms and conditions of employment. We have in Australia what's known as enterprise agreements. So there's an agreement between the employer and the employees. When you change from DP1 to DP2, you've got to have within that agreement that people are going to be working in self-managing groups, and as a group they'll be accountable and responsible for meeting the goals of their group. So clauses like that have to be built in, and because that's a legal way of organising work. So it's under what they call awards, union awards. So they spell out all the terms and conditions of employment, and it's a legal agreement between the employer and the employee. The wages and the safety and all those sorts of things come through. So, so there needs to be that needs to be thought through. And normally we have a terms and conditions group working in parallel with the transformation group that we've trained up to do these participating design workshops. Then there's what we call mechanisms for coordination. If you've got hundreds of teams, how are they going to coordinate what they're doing? How do you make sure there's not duplication of effort? How do we learn from each other some of the smart things that the teams have been doing? So you've got to set up what we call mechanisms for coordination. You've got to look at other things to make sure that the design works. That could be technology. We need information. Currently, we get information on a monthly basis. Teams might say, no, that's not good enough. We can't achieve our goals. We need it on a weekly basis. So the IT department then has to look at how do we get information to operational groups so they can achieve their goals, and how do we get it to them more quickly. And last but not least, how does the new structure improve those intrinsic motivators? So that's basically a 2-day workshop. In the telco example, it was actually a 3-day workshop because the technical system was so complex. But I'll go through these examples here and show you the number of workshops that we actually had to do, and then how you integrate it all. Are there any questions on that
Fred,
process?
Peter, well, one of the things that I'm hearing you say is that there are goals for the teams, but
Yep.
that those goals have to be able to kind of add up or reinforce the broader strategic goals for the business.
That's correct, yes. And that's it.
Is that something you try to work out in these 3 briefing periods?
Yeah, that's why it's so important that up front the senior management come in and spell out what the business strategic goals are. So, and then the people at the operational level look at, well, you know, quality and reducing costs are critical for us to remain competitive. Then they start looking, well, how can we at the operational level become much more efficient and produce a higher quality product or service? And because people know what's working well and what isn't in their part of the business, when they're given the opportunity, they've often got some great ideas to improve efficiencies, like in the manufacturing example I'll talk about in a minute. So just giving them the opportunity to, it often frustrates them. They know that, look, if we, like Bert was saying before, if we could improve these communication flows between the emergency department and ICU, we'd be much more efficient. You actually see the enthusiasm coming out in these workshops of people coming up with bright ideas and sparking ideas off each other. It normally has an impact straight away.
One of the things that worries me a little bit in DP1, it seems like the second, third, and even senior level managers are often focused on the operations problems, but not thinking clearly about the strategic problems. So it almost seems like you're going to have to meet with the senior managers to make sure they think through those strategic issues before you're able to do the actual participative design workshop. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's it's the big corporates, you know, they have their big planning department, so yeah, they're usually on top of the strategic goals for the business, you know, to a healthy future and direction. But it's surprising the number of even middle size organisations that basically running on the smell of an oily rag, and they don't have clearly defined strategic goals. They think they do, but a lot of them are just motherhood statements. So yeah, you're right there, Pete. That's part of the participative design workshop is to actually get clearly defined, clear strategic goals and strategies in place, so that that can be communicated to people at the front line, so that then they can do their bit in terms of helping the business meet its overall strategic goals. And the middle management become, one of their key roles is to monitor the performance of operational groups to see whether they're on track or not, and to provide a, to help them if, you know, the raw material, for instance, as I was saying before from the shoe manufacturing example, if they're dealing, you know, with players in the ecosystem, they're trying to help the frontline groups achieve their goals.
So Peter, yeah, if I could, Peter Sorensen's comment or question there evokes something for me that I wonder, and really what it reminds me of, and this may have been the person you thought about at the University of San Francisco, who was Ron Purser and Steve Cabana.
I know Ron and Steve.
Their book on the self-managing organization builds off PDW principles, right?
Yeah.
And if you move to a DP2 structure, as you say, when you talk about the middle management level, it does require a redesign of what tends to be their viewed function. Because in DP1, they see themselves controlling downwards in terms of hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
But in DP2, that control downwards now is eliminated or much less significant.
Yeah.
But there still are contributions around resourcing and tactics and all that, where there's a really valuable role of middle management. So do you find, Peter, that you need to work at multiple levels here so that you don't just have DP2 sort of trying to emerge at one level, but it's having to contend with a higher level that's trying to still function as a DP1?
Yeah. Yeah, that's where you get most of the pushback, is in that middle management group, because they, I mean, if you're in charge of you know, 50, 100 people reporting to you, you go down to talk to your mates at the pub. Yeah, I've got an important job and things like that. If that's then taken away, then what's in it for those people? And normally they've got fantastic knowledge of the business, so they can move into those middle resource type roles. So they've got a longer planning horizon, so they're looking at new equipment, new technology, commissioning of that, or they're engaged in training frontline workers. But quite a few of them say, this is not for me. It's part of, you know, their identity, if you like, and they can't cope with a new way of working. So you often get a lot of red herrings thrown up in workshops. Oh, this is not going to work. We've tried this before, all that sort of stuff. Or they won't participate at all. And that's when I go through the preparation and planning. It's critical that the CEO, the board, senior management are on top of this, and They don't just shove it off to, you know, this department over here is going to go to DP2. They have to be on board. They have to understand that some people are going to reject it and fight against it. And, you know, like the CEO says, look, if you're not on board with this, we're putting in a redundancy program so that, and one of the examples I give, the disability care one, they knew that they had so many middle management, it was just overloaded with unproductive work, that they knew that they would lose a lot of people. So they put in a redundancy program to say to people, look, we'll give you 6 months. You can have 6 months to try this out. If still after 6 months it's not for you, well, you can take this package and go and look for another job. So they're the sorts of things that have to be put in place as part of the preparation and planning. It's not just the strategic goals and but all these other things that are going to disrupt people's, particularly those middle management, their working lives. And that's why I'm saying it's a change of DNA in the organisation, and it has, you know, some big impacts on people. Has really positive impacts on people in the front line. They love it. Some people in middle management love it because they can move into more productive type roles rather than just putting out fires and supervising people. But for some who love the command and control type structure and kicking ass and all that sort of thing, they no, this is not for me.
Well, Peter, yeah, what you've explained is very real in terms of my experience. And over the years, one of the struggles I've had is, in terms of the actual design process, is thinking about whether or not we need to work on organization design at these multiple levels almost simultaneously. Because if you do DP2 development at say, a lower level of operational work, very, very well, I mean, the people who are in your S1 sort of roles and all that, the middle,
Yeah.
They tend to see themselves as victims because you've done something which suddenly changes them, as opposed to being in a more proactive role where once they understand design principle 2, they can start to anticipate what this might mean for the possibilities of their role. And I often wonder whether or not we need to be able, particularly in this day and age, work almost simultaneously at these different levels.
Yep. We have briefing sessions for middle management. First of all, briefing sessions with senior management, the board, all the goals, all that sort of stuff's right. But we also take them through workshops to introduce them to the participative design workshops. We even get them to measure their intrinsic motivators.
Right.
And then we brief middle management to say there's going to be this type of structure is going to mean fundamental change to the way you do work. But we want to design work that meets, it improves the intrinsic motivation and makes jobs more meaningful for you, and have career paths within middle management. So there's, a whole lot of preparation and planning beforehand before you even get to run a PD workshop. And they're sanctioned from the top, but they start at the bottom of the organisation at the operational level, because when you get people at the operational front line to redesign their work and come up working in self-managing groups and having goals to they want to meet, they start to spell out what they need from management to help them achieve those goals. So like I was saying before, that information might have to become rather monthly, weekly or daily. So how does middle management then work to make sure that that happens, so that they become a resource for the teams at the front line? Anyway, let's have a quick look at these examples here. What I tried to do was give examples across different types of sectors and different sized organisations. So the manufacturing one was only about 100 people. The telco one, there was, when I was working there, I was contracted there, was 50,000. And the disability care was about 2,500 people. So different sectors, different size businesses. So this manufacturing example was, it's an international company, and it's making detonators, which are about the size of a pen. But they can, if full of ammonium nitrate, they can blow your arm off if people, you know, are careless with those detonators. So this was an interesting little project where management, the plant management didn't want the plant to close. Head office in Sydney wanted to import the product from China because it was much cheaper and it was pretty, you know, standardized product. It's pretty easy to get into the country. But because this operation was, you're dealing with ammonium nitrate, it was way out in about 3 hours drive west of Brisbane. So I was in an isolated area. Even on site, you have a manufacturing this part of the business in this section. The office was about 100 metres away, and the warehouse was another 100 metres away. They were all separate buildings, so if one building blew up, it didn't take out all the others, like what happened in Beirut. So when that ammonium nitrate blew up. So so the company we were dealing with, they had a big manufacturing plant of producing ammonium nitrate. Some of that went into fertilizer, others went into explosives, and I was dealing with this explosive plant. The people there were in a remote area. They didn't want to lose their jobs because if they did, it'd be hard to get another job. Management thought, well, let's set up a team-based structure. And I asked Marilyn Emery, could she do some analysis for me? And we did a survey looking at the intrinsic motivators we measured in the survey. And we also measured people's mental health. And that was a survey that was Marilyn and Don Daguerre developed for their mental health in the workplace project. So it measured things like the energy of people, their whether they felt anxious or depressed. All those sorts of factors were determined in. Marilyn did a causal path analysis of the information we gained from the surveys, and what it showed was management, in their efforts to set up a team-based structure, some parts of the business were self-managing, DP2. Others, other parts of the business, they just changed this S1's title to team leader, and they thought that was a self-managing team, but it was still DP1. And other parts of the business, management set up team-based structures without goals, and it was just laissez-faire, do what you like, which is even much worse situation than DP1. You think of Lord of the Flies. That's what happens when you have a laissez-faire structure where people just don't know what's happening. So we had what's called mixed mode. So you had a mixture of DP1 and DP2. And mixed mode is cropping up everywhere. You know, the agile movement, where they're trying to set up well, they're setting up self-managing teams of IT systems people to get product out to a customer or a beta product out very quickly. They're working very well, they're cross-functional teams. Then they try and get that concept of agile to take hold in the rest of the organisation. And they can't do it because they've got mixed mode. And when you get mixed mode, you get a whole lot of tensions occurring between the self-managing groups and the traditional DP1 structures. And you get amplification of those dynamics of dependency and fight-flight that I was talking about before. So to really scale agile, you need to understand the design principles. Anyway, so that's what was happening in that structure. We did our analysis. Engagement was really low. An independent consulting group came in and measured employee engagement, and it was rock bottom. And this was the structure that they had in place, typical, you know, production type structure. So how did I design the PDWs for this? Well, I did a PDW for all the daytime office workers. So the pink, the green, and the orange colour. We did a PDW for them, and then I did 3 PDWs for the blue area, the production. So I did one for the day shift, one for the afternoon shift, and one for the night shift. And then we brought all that together. So people from reps from each of those PDWs came together, and we put together an integrated design like this one here. Well, this was the design. So that when we put that together, they were able to dramatically improve productivity, especially in the production teams. They in the DP1 structure and management's efforts to set up team-based structures, they thought it was good. Would be good for the day, afternoon, and night shift to have quotas and compete against each other, and that caused all sorts of problems. So, as I explained in the briefing paper, it led to high levels of waste and defects being handed on to other shifts. So when they worked in this type of structure, had 24-hour goals, the production teams developed a split shift system so that they could handle all those defects. So they improved output by, I think from memory, about 40%. And that got their unit costs down to a cost where they could compete with the Chinese imports. So that structure enabled that operation to continue as it was. Head office were really pleasantly surprised that they could do it. And yeah, it was you know, a good outcome for that group, and they kept their goals. They kept their operation. Their that group, the independent consulting group that measured the intrinsic motivators, came in afterwards, and they measured the engagement again, and that went from 32%, I think it was, in DP1 to over 50% in DP2, and that was within 6 months. So that was a little example there of you know, a successful DP2 operation. we also engaged the unions in that one. The unions helped out with putting the pay for skill system together. So that was it's a whole lot of good work there done by the AMWU, which is Australian Metal Workers Union. So that's that example. The telco example was, 50,000 people. This one, they were going to lose a major airline customer because the silo structure was just causing too many things to fall through the cracks. So we set up what's called a managed network service, which was looking at managing the digital communications network for these major corporations. And this airline was an international airline, and but the telco was causing so many problems that the chairman of the airline company, who I knew, and unfortunately since died, he said to the CEO of the telco company, look, we're really disappointed with what the service you're providing. You're causing people to miss out on booking flights digitally. You're causing our airlines to be delayed, aircraft to be delayed. What we're going to do, we want to stay with you, but if you don't improve, we're going to go elsewhere. But in the meantime, we're going to fine you $50,000 for every aircraft you delay by more than 10 minutes, which amounted to millions of dollars. So it was a huge issue for the business. It was one of their key customers. And we interviewed some senior people from the airline business about the sorts of service they were getting from the telco. And our poor old PA, who was taking notes, said, do I really have to type up those expletives? They were so furious. And I asked one of the senior managers, will this telco ever win your preferred supplier award? And he said, as long as my bottom points to the ground, they will never win the preferred supplier award. But more colourful language than that. So they really hated this telco. Anyway, we were able to turn around the business by redesigning managed network services to a DP2 structure. But, it had to happen very quickly. We had 90 days to do it, to turn it around. So it was impossible to change a 50,000 person organisation to DP2. So the idea was to set up what's called a virtual company. So we identified all the key skills that were required to deliver that managed network service. And we presented this to senior management. We actually did a trial in Tasmania of the same idea. So providing managed network services to the Tasmanian government, and it worked fantastically well. So we were able to go to the CEO and the group managing directors to say, here's our proposal to get a team-based structure, DP2 structure into managed network services. And this is what we achieved with Networking Tasmania. And they said, yep, sounds really good. We have to move quickly. We will help you, but there's a few constraints. There's no new hires. You've got to use the people that come out of the silos to work in these team-based structures. You can't go and hire new people, and a few other constraints as well. So we had to work and what we said is that we can't have mixed mode. We can't set up these teams within a large bureaucracy because we know it would get killed. People would kill it off. So we said we need a separate physical location, and it was they agreed to that, and we had a whole floor of an office in a building in Sydney, in the middle of Sydney. So that was all set up, and so we had a what we call the hierarchy of function there. So the yellow group was the senior group in the managed network services, and they were dealing with all the big vendors that were involved. Cisco were involved with this. Actually, they were one of the key players providing the technology. And part of our preparation and planning, we realised that Cisco was not only a customer of the telco and a supplier of the telco, but was also a competitor. So we actually run a separate workshop, a strategic planning modified search conference, to sort out the framework within and the policies that Cisco would be engaged within this particular new operation. So, and there were other big players. There was Nortel, which I think was a Canadian company, which has gone out of business actually. Huawei destroyed that business, I believe. I'm told by some people within this telco. There were other big players, Alcatel. So there was, it had a lot of focus from senior management. They were looking at this very closely. Anyway, we identified all the key players across those silos and got them into into the room in up near Newcastle, north of Sydney, and we thrashed this out for 3 days. The technical system across those silos was so complex, it took us a whole day just to understand it. There were activation and insurance processes mainly. But there weren't, it was multi-dimensional when you're dealing with internet protocol. So there were layers and layers of process mapping. And the telco, to try and get some sort of semblance of cooperation across those WAN, ISDN, SDN silos, sales, teleservice, employed sales engineers, service engineers, hundreds of them, to coordinate across the silos, and there were hundreds of project managers as well. And their role was to actually coordinate and try and reduce the things falling through the gaps between those silos, because what was happening is that you get the boss, say, of WAN, wide area networks, saying, yeah, we've met all our goals. So there was a real focus on the silo. And then the ISDN person will say, yeah, we've met all our goals. And, but when you look at from the airline company's point of view, they were looking not vertically, they were looking across. And when you start looking at, say, 90% achieved in WAN, 90% achieved in ISDN, SDN, you go 90 by 90 is 80, 8.1, 8.1 by another 90 is 70. So you're getting across the silos a real drop in performance. And that's why the telco had to hire all these service engineers and project managers to try and get some sort of coordination across them to help their big clients like the airline business. So during the workshop, we got the service engineers during the participative design workshop to actually help us map out the technical system. And when you had Cisco technicians in the room and other technicians in the room who were working out in the field, they looked at that and said, no, that's not right, that's incorrect. So the technical engineers thought that they had everything ironed out, mapped out, but when you actually got people in the field to look at the technical system, it was incorrect. So we had to spend that whole day trying to get that sorted out. Anyway, we eventually got to a design, and that was the structure they came up with. So this is a structure. This is the one that was working in the separate building in Sydney. So you had the what we call the global airline management team. So that was the management team looking at monitoring the performance of that response and internal support team. And then above that, you had the managed network service group, which was looking at other big customers like banks and so forth. But this was just one. This was just the design for the airline business. And once that was set up, it met its service level agreements month after month after month after month, 100%. So the operation they set up, it looked like a NASA control room. So on the whole floor of this building, you had the entire airline's local and national digital network service. You could see all the traffic that was taking place. So if a router went down, these technicians could work together across the different silos, and we're all now in the one room. Let's reroute the traffic so there's no delays. And then other technicians will come in on site and change that router. So that's what the internal support group would do, but the response team would work within the floor in the building in Sydney, monitoring the traffic. And the airline company was so impressed with what that group could deliver that it won the Supplier of the Year award, you know, beating big companies like Boeing and so forth. So,
Peter, can you, just a really quick question.
yeah.
Do I understand it correctly that for this care team structure, some of the participants and skills were co-located and some were virtually integrated? Is that correct?
Well, the people working in the blue teams came from the silos with their specific technical skills. So they were specialists in their field. So they were specialist WAN technicians and teleservice technicians and so forth. So you couldn't get I don't know whether I'm answering your question, Bert, but you couldn't get multi-skilling across this
Right.
group because they were so specialised. So it'd be like having in the emergency department, for instance, you'd have an anaesthetist and an ED specialist and someone who might be a cardiologist or whatever. They're so specialised. They still work in a team, but they control their part of the work, but together they coordinate their activities to meet the goals. So they couldn't get multi-skilling in this group. So it's not like the example I gave before. So they would come out of those silos, an individual would come out of those silos, so a Cisco technician, for instance, and work in this group for 6 months. Then they'd go back into their silos for an update on new technology, new training, because it was the technology is changing so quickly. So their silos became a centre of excellence for them in terms of getting up to speed with the new technology, the new types of routers and all that sort of thing. But when they came across to this building in Sydney, they worked as a self-managing group, and they had responsibilities of meeting the service level agreements of the service requirements of the airline company. The Green Group, they were a resource group in the building, and they dealt with all the silos outside of this group, so the technical silos and other parts of the telco business, so that they made sure that there was, that the things were running smoothly between the specialist blue groups here and the rest of the organisation. So they set up service level agreements between the Green Group, set up service level agreements between the telco silos and the blue group. They also managed the interface with all the other the Cisco companies, the Nortel and Alcatel and all the others that were involved in that. So yeah, so it was so successful, as I said, it won them the Supplier of the Year award for that airline company, and it led. I worked in there for another 8 years or so doing similar sort of projects, but for big corporations, and for the banks and things like that. And we set up some. We set up a whole unit in Western Australia in Perth to manage all of that. And you had, from memory, you had these similar sorts of groups, the blue groups, but they were managing corporates, say from whose name started, say from A through to D. So one of the banks was ANZ. So and then there was other big corporations. One group would manage a chunk of corporations, and another group would manage another group of corporations, but they all would support each other. So if someone was away, they'd back each other up and things like that. Yeah, it was quite successful to have a DP2 structure set up within that huge bureaucracy. The only thing that we weren't able to do is that we couldn't alter their terms and conditions of employment. They had to stick with the original DP1 terms and conditions of employment. It was just too complex to change. So if a new CEO came in and there's not that formal agreement there, then that CEO could dismantle that straight away if they wanted to. But I don't think they would, because it was producing such fantastic results.
Peter, we have about 10 minutes left on the broadcast.
Okay, I'll just quickly go through the last one. This was a disability care one, and this was a project led by the People and Culture Director, who had experienced DP1 and DP2 in a previous organisation. And what was happening in disability care was that it's a $20-odd billion business that's supported by the federal government. They changed what used to happen within disability care was that, people with various levels of disability, so it might be someone who got injured in a car accident, and might need some help around the home, through to someone who's got really high care needs and can't communicate, and needs 24-hour, 7 days a week help. So you got that range of disability. And what would normally happen is that you get community groups that would come together, and the federal government would fund them to help those people in their community, or they could be church-based groups that would come together and help people with the various forms of disability. So they weren't what I'd say business savvy type organisations. So what the government used to do was just provide them with block funding. So huge chunks of money every 3 months or so to help them support people in their homes, or they might be in accommodation. And if they went over budget, they just put up their hand and say, look, we need another $1 million or whatever to provide this service. And it was just becoming a bottomless pit. So the government said, no, we're going to change the way we fund this disability. So we will set up what's called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So a person with high care needs will be assessed and they will get so much funding per annum to meet the support they need, their wheelchairs, occupational therapists, the whole lot. And then they would decide which care provider they would go to. So it meant the care providers had to really become much more customer focused and not just, if they were running out of money, put up their hand and say, we need more money. They were getting their money from the person with disability and their guardians. So it really changed the way that they were doing their business. And the CEO of the organisation back in 2017 did a presentation to the board and said, look, we're going to go out of business if we don't change the way we structure. We're just so top heavy with so many supervisory levels. I mean, there were some places that we looked at where one person reported to another person, reported to another person, reported. So these were single reports, 4 of them in a row, with doing all this unproductive work. Anyway, the HR people and culture director said to the CEO, look, we need to really move to a DP2 structure. And that's when they brought Marilyn and myself in. So that was the basis of of getting us to help them. And like with the previous examples, they're burning platforms. We can't stay with the status quo, otherwise we lose our customer. We shut down our business and get the product from China, or in this case, we're going to go out of business. So they brought us in, and this is just one little example. It was a really challenging project, this one, because you had disability care in the major metropolitan capital cities, Sydney, Melbourne, etc. You also had disability care in regional centres, and you had disability care in really remote centres. So looking after Aboriginal communities way up in Arnhem Land, up around Darwin Way. So it was quite a complex total redesign, PDWs. The other interesting part about it is that the product, if you like, the people with disability, their disabilities changed over time. So you had to have a way of monitoring that. And it was a really challenging, Marilyn and I were really stretched in getting this one off the ground. And as I said, there was about 2,500 people involved in it. We had to look at how do we design a whole series of PDWs to get everybody involved in the process. So what we did was we got a map of Australia and drew up areas around Australia where there was approximately 100 people that were providing care. So in Sydney, for instance, you'd have maybe two groups of, or three groups of 100 in one suburb. In parts of Western Australia, you would have one group of 100 covering 1 million square kilometres or something like that. So we had to design it that way. And then we, for each of those 100, we take 20% and get them in to do a PDW. And before that, we trained up a whole lot of people. We trained up a transformation team so that they could, rather than Meryl and I travelling around the country, we had people who could run the PDWs. So that took place. There were take-back workshops, so that take-back PDWs, so that those that couldn't be involved were had input into the design. And then there was I worked with the CEO once we got all those designs to set up a total national integrated DP2 design. So this is just one example of how we integrated the Tasmanian and the Victorian operations. So on the left-hand side is the specialist support. They were the S1s, S2s, S3s. So they're providing training. They're helping the other five groups, with their care providers, helping them with things like the plans that people have. The people with disability have certain plans which reflects their the remuneration they get from the government. So those plans, they have to be on top of those plans all the time. So that's where the specialist support people are helping out there. They're also helping out with training. Yes, so in the DP1 structure, you had a whole lot of low skilled, low wage people, and which is what Pete Sorensen was saying before. These a lot of those workers had to move from one disability care provider to another just to have to cover their weekly, food bills and things like that. They were basically donkey type jobs. When this new structure came, this new way of remunerating people, the disability care providers, you got people like fund managers coming in and saying, look, we can run this, we can run these sorts of disability care providers. We'll get this large chunk of money and we'll just pay these people low wages and we'll make a fortune out of it. So it's the same way the aged care sector's being run, and it's causing, that's why we're getting all these issues with COVID and people dying because of the low skill, low wage, low cost of running those businesses, and those poor workers having to move from one care provider to the next to be able to, get a decent wage. So it's this type of structure here we've put in place with the unions, career path structures. So now that people working in these organisations have to have a certain level of qualification, and we've developed career path structures for them, so they move up a care career path. And there's quite a bit of skill involved in this. I haven't got time to talk about it, but some of these people have to be trained in defence, because some people who have got a disability can all of a sudden just go bang and start hitting you and attacking you, and you've got to be able to manage that situation. So it's quite a complex business to run, actually. Anyway, I haven't got time to talk about it now. That was the integrated national disability structure. So yeah, on the left-hand side there, the blue one, the frontline service delivery teams, there's about 90 of them, and they were getting support, direct support from head office teams. So yeah, it's we saw that this is still going. I started to see improvements straight away because you had a lot of processes that weren't standardised, and as soon as the teams came together, they started to standardise their processes. So from accommodation house 1 under the old structure would have different processes in accommodation house 2. And therefore, it was very difficult to get someone from house 1 to go to house 2 because they had to learn a whole new set of processes and how they were dealing with helping people. So they started to work straight away on standardising processes. I think we're out of time, but the planning and preparation steps, they're critical. We've sort of covered those as we spoke, but you need to get your key players understand the design principles because of the, as I said, it's changed in DNA. You've got to get commitment from the CEO, senior management. We do organisational health assessments to see if there's mixed mode or other issues, mental health issues. Then the CEO has to go out and communicate to all the troops and the rationale for change. They sometimes set up online communication channels so people can, they've got questions, they come into the CEO's office and then he or she would then communicate on a weekly basis and address these questions. Involve feedback from ecosystem members because your whole ecosystem has to be on board with this, because one player can bring down the whole system, as I mentioned with the shoe manufacturer. You train, set up a transformation team, so you train them in the PDW so that there's an internal skills group, body of knowledge within the group, so that any more changes have to take place, they can do it themselves. In the current environment, those transformation teams need to know how to design work for hybrid workers, working remotely. This is an important one. I reckon they need, those transformation groups particularly, need to have a working knowledge of artificial intelligence and machine learning, because there's so many opportunities that come out when you do the process mapping and identify all the errors. One quick example, in that disability care provider, some of the staff were inexperienced in terms of identifying things like aspiration pneumonia. The experienced staff could pick up whether a person with high care needs was suffering from aspiration pneumonia just through their demeanour, the way they looked. Inexperienced personnel weren't able to pick up, and that would escalate into going into emergency service like you were talking about before, Bert, and then into ICU. There is technology that you can use to monitor whether people have got pneumonia and things like that with, oxygen saturation levels. And so it's I think in today's environment, it's important that people at least have a working knowledge of that type of technology that relates to their industry. They also need to know about scaling agile teams or scaling mixed mode, how you stop mixed mode and be able to scale within an organisation DP2. So the example I gave with the telco, where we had to set up a separate entity and not have it destroyed by the huge DP1 democracy. The same thing, and have you heard of Bert's-Org, the healthcare organisation? It's finding it hard to scale because they don't understand the design principles. They start off with, you can get a Bert's-Org operation up and running as long as it's greenfields, a startup. But if you try to redesign a aged care facility, an existing traditional one, and try to ram in or force feed a Birdsall model into it, it won't work. And they've been in Australia now for over 2 years, and they can't get it to scale. They can't convert traditional into a Birdsall, and that's because they don't understand the design principles and the mixed mode. And then I've covered the others there. So I'm happy to, if anybody's got, other questions that they want to have a chat about, or they've got a potential client that is thinking about going to DB2, and if you want to have a chat about it, I'm happy to share my experiences. I'm not, the world expert in this. There's plenty of other people who've got some good ideas, but I'm willing to, share what I've learned over the years. So hopefully it speaks.
I have a question, Peter, but I'm going to hold off until maybe Catalina or Irina or Peter asks theirs. I do have a question for you.
Okay. Go for it.
Oh, well, all right. I was going to wait for other people to jump in with theirs, but I've asked enough questions. Peter, you and I know that the PDW kind of methodology has been around for, something like 40, 50 years, right?
Yeah.
Maryland.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I'd be, and you've been with that, a lot of that, what I'd be interested in is